So, pastel, this is one of my favorite mediums. With pastel, um, you can generally, when you're starting out, you're going to be looking at buying some kind of set. There's lots of different sets of pastels you can buy, um, and you'll find that you're either going to be getting small little sticks like this, or they may come full sticks wrapped up with the paper of the maker of the pastel. The brand I mostly work with is Sennelier. I also use Rembrandt pastels a lot. Another important point to consider with pastel is your surface. There are, any paper can work with pastel, but ideally you're going to want to look for something with a lot of tooth to it. And I like to work on surfaces that have a bit of grit or sand to them. So this is called Pastel Card. Different makers make this. This one's by Sennelier. It's basically a cardstock of toned paper with a layer of sand coated on it, so that it really has a nice rough texture and really picks up the color well. It also allows you to really blend and layer over successive the time you're working on the drawing. One of the things you'll find with pastel is that if you start to layer too much, you fill the tooth of the page, and then you're no longer laying down new color. You're sort of creating more of a mud with the pastel. And there are ways to work with that, which I'll talk about a little bit. If you're working with the pastel for any extended amount of time, I definitely recommend wearing gloves. This is just a purple nitrile glove. So you may take a little bit of getting used to, but there are some pretty intense pigments in some of these pastels, and having them building up on your hands over a long period of time isn't great. The other thing you might want to consider is an air purifier right in your immediate working area. Pastel can create a lot of dust, and we have a tendency to want to blow it off the page. And it's just something to kind of avoid getting too much of in your lungs. So similar to charcoal, we're going to be talking about blending a little bit. So I'm going to, again, look at my apple here and as a reference and start showing some ways to begin working with pastel. Generally, unless you're working monotone, so with maybe just one or two colors, you're not going to want to start going really bright or really dark. Start with somewhere in the middle. Initially, I like to just pick a couple contrasting colors that are going to start to build the color palette of the piece. So with this apple, I might just look at red and green. Red using more for the lighter mid-tones, and the green going more towards the shadows. And the reason for that is if you just start right off the bat with a really bright color of pastel, it's going to quickly take over and start to muddy the drawing. So I often, again, just like to start with a nice, simple, really light sketch, just trying to orient myself to the page, to the subject. The nice thing about pastel is you have this whole surface to work with. So You can work with the end to make simple little lines, turn it on its side to start to build up areas of color. And so initially just blocking in the initial shapes. One of the fun things about pastels, obviously you can really easily come in and blend these colors to start to fill areas of color quickly. And then go back in and work over that. When you're blending with pastel, avoid using your hands as much as possible. Same with really charcoal or any other material you're working with. Using your hands, you're going to start to build up oil on the surface. So either, if you're wearing a glove, that's great, or use a rag or paper towel. And initially, a lot of the blending I do is really just in the beginning. I don't want to, again, the more you're sort of blending the pastel, the more you're just filling in the tooth of the paper and kind of compressing it in there. Use it, but also one of the wonderful things about pastel is the way you can layer different lines and textures. I would say for me, the main way I'm working with it is in this sort of cross-hatching way. One of my favorite pastel artists is Degas, and if you ever look at one of his works, you'll just see these layers of cross-hatched lines in there. And what this does is it builds up you might call it like a perceived color. So, even though there's a lot of red in this apple, I'm coming in here with blues. I'm about to come in with some yellows. The eye takes the whole scene and puts it together. And so some blue and yellow crossed over on each other like this can actually start to look quite green. But it also just adds a more sort of exciting depth to it. You really get a sense, especially as you start to crosshatch in this way and layer marks going in different directions, you can almost see the timeline of the drawing in this way. And it has a really nice quality to it. I'll show some examples in a little bit of some more finished work. So again, one of the wonderful things about pastel is you just get these very bright, vibrant colors right off the bat. So there isn't a lot of time to go into color and depth today, but One thing I will say about color is, as you're especially working from life, really consider that when you see something, even if maybe you're looking at a tree and the predominant color we're seeing in that is green, you really might find actually every color contained in whatever it is that you're looking at. You might see that green leaf, and as you look closer, you start to see some purples, maybe some blues and reds, yellows, depending on the time of day. Drawing is really a process of working with your mind. And really kind of getting out of this state that we think we know what's going on. Letting yourself be surprised and draw what you see, not what you know. In other words, what are you actually observing, not what do you think you're observing. So I'm really letting myself just kind of be playful with the color in this. There's a variety of colors. Yeah, I mean, there is, it's interesting. As you start to look at something in this way, I mean, you start to realize, the depth of what's there is sort of infinite. And sometimes I kind of have to pull myself back out of that. It's almost like you get a little bit entranced. So I kind of pull myself back out. A really helpful technique is to actually soften your gaze or blur your eyes a little bit. And this can really help to kind of diffuse what you're seeing, capture some of the more, the main areas of light and shape, rather than getting so lost in the details. So one thing I'll point out here is I haven't gone to black. I haven't used any black so far on this. And I really haven't used white either. There's a bit of a gray over here. But use black and white with caution. Even a lot of times in black, there's a lot of color involved. So just going pure black usually isn't going to be accurate, and it can sort of pull away from the interest of the drawing a little bit. So at the end here, I kind of start to use a little bit more of the brighter highlighting colors. I think one of the fun things about pastels, you do have these pigments that just have these beautiful bright tones, and you can get them with all sorts of different shades of pinks and light blues. Like for instance, here's a kind of nice bright light blue color that I'm going to use just to really pull out some of these highlights here. So I think we'll leave that for now. So again, just a quick sketch, but as you're starting to work with a material and you're starting to work observationally from drawing, again, let yourself play with contrast. So really not being afraid to pull out the shadows, finding those shapes of light. And even looking right here, I'm realizing there's this beautiful shadow right here that I kind of missed. So as with Pastel, especially as you're working on a drawing for a while and building up layers on it, it can start to get muddy, and even if I were to maybe want to, similar to what I did with the charcoal, to kind of take this initial sketch and just really let it soften and become the ground for working, which, this happens many times in a drawing for me. If I'll be sharing more of my drawing progressions, but you'll see that they get worked and reworked many times, and whole areas will just be wiped away and sort of rebuilt. And it's fun. It's like, now it's like the shape of it is still there. The kind of, there's something of it still there, and I almost have this middle tone ground to now work from, and so I could even kind of start to build some of these highlights again. And just kind of go in fresh. But after doing this for a while, you're going to find that the surface begins to deteriorate. So fixative can be a really important tool as you're working on pastel drawings. The Sennelier brand of fixative is great. The Krylon brand is great. And the way I use it is, between layers. So, if I had worked on this for a while and I could tell that the color was, you can almost tell you're just kind of smearing the pastel at a point rather than applying fresh material. So that's a point where I might just do a layer or two of fixative, and what that does is help to just build up a bit of a fresh surface, and you can keep going. You still preserve what's underneath it. It's a clear coat, but you can start to work over that with more detail. I will say, though, I don't tend to fix pastel drawings once they're done. I do find that the fixative will deteriorate certain tones and pigments, especially the brighter colors. Once I've really laid in highlights and brighter tones, it can deteriorate those a little bit, I've found. There's a lot of different viewpoints on that, but so I'll generally use the fixative with pastel in the process of working and layering, not so much as a final fix, which does end up presenting a lot of problems in how you actually preserve and work with a pastel drawing when it's done. Still something I'm figuring out, but it's definitely a very sensitive media. One other thing that's really nice with pastel is you can really use them for quick color studies. And what I mean by that is, just picking a subject. Still lifes are great, maybe something outdoors. And, not worrying so much, again, about the detail of what you're capturing or even the specificity of the shapes, but really just exploring the major blocks of color initially, and then working in kind of in more and more detail. So what are the major areas of color? What are you seeing? And then just exploring. You know, if we're working in color, we don't want to shy away from color. So, you know, be bold with it.